Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University.
Dear students, welcome to the lecture on Translation Studies. We are discussing the course of Diploma in Translation Studies. This is unit number 4 and we are going to discuss Indian theories of translation, specifically early period of Indian theories of translation or Indian traditions of translation. Whenever we are talking about India, each of us would know that India is considered as linguistic area. But if you see in the later periods of time, in the 20th century or 21st century, now the same analogy, same comparison has been made for India as translation area also. Why do you think so? This analogy would have been made. So if you see, Indians are always translating. Whenever I'm talking to you, many a times I would be talking in Gujarati, in Hindi, in English, and maybe many a times when I am thinking certain things, I would think in Gujarati and then would be translating on the spot in English. So if you see, Indian consciousness is also considered as translation consciousness. That's why now India, when we are talking about India, it is not just linguistic area, but also translation area that many scholars have discussed, many scholars have argued about. Also, when we are talking about Indian context, undoubtedly the problem of periodization would come when we are doing diachronic study of translation. And it becomes very difficult to divide them into periods whenever we are thinking about history of translation, periodizing the history of translation. So one of the solutions that is given by Susan Besnett, translation scholar, she says that this problem of periodization in the West, it was the same. So we have George Steiner. We have talked about history of translation in West, in which we talked about George Steiner. And if you see, he managed to overcome this problem of periodization, of diachronic study of history of translation. What he did is divided the various phases of translation theories into unequal periods. So if you see the first period from Cicero to 1795, and then if you see 1790s or 1790s to 1780s, there are 4 periods, if you remember, that we had discussed. So if you see, the major chunk is the first period, then 200 years, and also so he managed to overcome by dividing various phases of translation theories into unequal time periods, right? And it is a predominant ideological emphasis are there rather than periodization like Roman era, Enlightenment, Romanticism, Modernism. It is not divided like conventional periods of history. Rather, it is predominantly ideological. Emphasis is there. So whenever we are talking about cultural history or historical periods of India, so it resists such Western models of periodization of literary history. Rather, we would focus on what were the predominant ideological emphasis. That's how we would discuss the history of translation in India. In this class, we will majorly focus on ancient and Buddhist period, and in the next class, we will discuss second millennium onwards. So if you see during the ancient and early India, so if you see during the period of ancient and or early India, you said, so we used various terms for the activity of translation in India. Specifically, there would have been words like anuvad, bhashantar, then tarjuma word has been many a times used. Even chaya anuvad, chaya is used. But dear students, remember, none of these terms are equivalent to or same to the word translation. Whenever we are talking about translation in a narrow sense, all these terms that were used in the early India be it tarjuma, anuvad, bhashantar, they are used in a broader sense which comes closer to translation. So these terms have history of their own. Let's look at these particular two terms which are very prevalent in India. One is anuvad and second is bhashantar. So what does anuvad means? If you divide the term Sanskrit word anu, which means after, and vad means to speak, to say something. So to say it again or say it after is the term that anuvad is used in the ancient India. And if you see this particular term, it denotes a practice in which the students, those who were studying in gurukuls, under their gurus, the students used to say something after to their gurus to remember in order to memorize it. There were Sanskrit shlokas, and if you see, we had memory based teaching in gurukuls. So they used to remember, and to memorize it, they used to say it after, they used to say it again. So this word anuvad is used to refer the habit of repeating something after, to confirm or either to support something that is already alluded. So if you see the word term anuvad, contrast to that we have bhashantar. And whenever we are talking bhashantar, we have a very prominent Gujarati scholar, Umashankar Joshi, who made the distinctions between anuvad and bhashantar. So what does bhashantar mean? It implies the change of language. It is not saying after, but when you change the language, that is bhashantar. So only change of formal properties of expression. Whereas if you look at the term anuvad, it implies an attempt to recapture the content and voice once again. Anuvad, repeat after. Bhashantar, changing the formal properties of whatever has been said or whatever has been written. So these were the prevalent terms in ancient India. What I'll do is first we will discuss the practice of translation in ancient and classical period. Then we also shall talk about the practice that was there in the Buddhist period. And then we will talk about what were the different theories or what was the contrast views between these two classical periods, whether similar or contrast. So when we talk about the practice of translation in ancient and classical period, there were renderings of fragments of the text that were there in the ancient literature. So many of the fragments were rendered from one language to another. This practice was very common during ancient India. But if you see the practice of turning the whole text, practice of changing the whole text was not there. So there were not text which was completely translated from one language to another in India. And commenting on the dearth of translation, we have a very good scholar that is Bodhanath Trivedi. And he says that in ancient and classical Sanskrit, there is a dearth of these translations due to that the India was far ahead of other countries in be it technical text, be it metaphysical, be it scientific knowledge. So India was far ahead of the others. There was no need of translating from other languages in Indian languages, specifically Sanskrit, which was the prevalent language during ancient India. So there was no need of these translations, and even if something that they would have come across, something new that they would have come across, what they would do, the scholars would internalize them and write it in Sanskrit language. So there was no need of translation during ancient India. They were inherent or they were internalized in Sanskrit. So even if there had been full translations, maybe suppose we assume that there were certain texts that were translated during ancient period, but if you see there are not extant today, we do not find any text which was translated in Sanskrit from other languages. Bodhanath Tiwari, he argues that even though there is dearth of translations, there is a similarity of certain texts and there is a possibility that they would have been translated from one language. So if for an example, there are portions of Rig Veda which after minor phonetic transformation resemble the parallel portions of the Zend Avesta that we have. This Avesta is nothing but it is the basic teachings of the Zoroaster, and also that is known as Gatha. The text is Zoroastrian text. So we have Zend Avesta which is very similar to the Rig Veda, and it resembles the parallel portions are there. So probably this one of the reasons that this text are similar, it could be because they would have been composed in one of the earlier languages. We do not know about which kind of language could have existed, but as there is a similarity between these two texts, specifically Rig Veda and Avesta, so this could have been emerged from one languages or one language. So this, he says, can be considered as an illustrations of translation or Rupantar during ancient India. So in classical Sanskrit drama, there was a convention of using Prakrits or non-Sanskrit languages. When you read certain Sanskrit text, there will be certain Prakrit language that would be there. Specifically, if you read texts like Kalidas. And what happens in that is that this Prakrit language is used by the people who are below middle class. Certain classes, like there would have been clones, there would have been servants, there would have been maid servants. So these dialogues that are spoken by these servants, they would be in Prakrit language or any non-Sanskrit regional languages. And if you look at this particular text, they have Chaya also. Chaya is shadows. So the Chaya would be in Sanskrit language. There are some portions of Rig Veda, and if you remove certain minor phonetic transformation, this Rig Veda, the portions of Rig Veda, they resemble to the Zoroastrian text Zend Avesta. Zend Avesta, basically it contains the teachings of the Zoroastrian teacher. And if you see, these are also known as Gatha. So what could be the reason for that? He argues that probably because they were composed in an earlier language from which this text could have been come up. So it can be considered as either Anuvad, and if not Anuvad, it can be considered as Rupantar, transformation. So in classical Sanskrits, if you see, there are also many drama. If you read any Sanskrit drama, there would be dialogues which would have been spoken by servants or maid servants or even clones. And if you read those dialogues, they are written in Prakrit or non-Sanskrit languages. That are regional languages, dialects basically. And then you see that the Chaya would have been provided. Chaya means shadows of it. So that would be Sanskrit translations basically of Prakrit dialogues that are there. So this is the practice that was done during ancient India when we talk about Sanskrit literature. And also Budhanath Tiwari believes that during Gupta age, that is the period from 4th century AD to 7th century AD. So many Prakrit texts must have been partially or even fully they would have been rendered into Sanskrit language. And now because the Prakrit text could have not been available, the Sanskrit translations are available. So some Prakrit Jain texts like we have Panch Sangrah or Vishitavishka, so they exist in the form of Sanskrit translations or even adaptations. They are translated partially or fully from Prakrit texts. So these are shadow translations. We call it Chayanuvad. So these shadow translations of many texts of Prakrit are now available. So we have Gundai's Brihad Katha which is there. So that would have been originally a composition of Paichasi Prakrit. Paichasi Prakrit is basically the language that would have been spoken by vampires. So they had many translations in Sanskrit that are available today. So if I give you some of the examples, like we have Brihad Kavya, Slok Sangrah, then we have Buddha Swami, we have Brihad Manjari, or even if you see, we have Katha Sarit Sagar by Somdev. So these are the translations that are available in Sanskrit of Prakrit text. So Sanskrit literature became very prosperous in Gupta era. So major texts of the Prakrit were translated into Sanskrit during this period, that is, which period? That is the period of Gupta era. Gatha Saptasti is there. These texts are attributed to Satvahan king Hala. And it is a wonderful anthology of love poems which are there in the Prakrit. So many verses from this collection that exists today in their Sanskrit avatar, Sanskrit translations, like we have Arya Shaptasti. So, though plenty of European texts and texts from other languages exist in Sanskrit today, there was poverty of translations in ancient and classic Sanskrit, because in ancient India, we were so rich in terms of knowledge. We did not require it from any other languages. And whatever something new would have come, we would have inherited and then we would have written that. Whenever we are talking about translation during Buddhist era, because of the spread of Buddhism, the translation activities was carried out on a larger scale in tandem with the spread of Buddhism in Asia and nearby countries which are there. Nearby countries to India. So Buddhist religion was born as an alternative to Vedic religion. We had Vedic literature or Vedic religion during ancient India. But this Buddhist religion was an alternative for Vedic religion. And it had a great appeal to the nearby nations of India. And because these countries had social institutions quite similar to those which are there in India. We have B.N. Mukherjee, and he has given an account of the spread of Buddhist thought into the heart of Central Asia and Afghanistan. So one can surmise the translation is out of the main activities that is associated with the proselytization. That is converting, making somebody believe with enough proofs, you convince them, you convert them. So proselytization was there on one hand, and also there was an evolution of the recipient Central Asian and Afghan languages on the other hand. With this, there was a spread of Buddhism and the translation took the central activity at that time. So B.N. Mukherjee provides a list of the Buddhist texts that were translated into other languages such as Kachhian, then we have Sogdian languages which are there, and they are alluded to the manuscripts of bilingual dictionaries, lexicons and handbooks for the translators are found now. He provides the whole list of that. And besides the Buddhist text in Pali and Sanskrit, many other texts are there. We have Panchatantra, Hitopadesh is there, we have various epics which are there. And there are also many other secular literature. They seem to have traveled to different parts of ancient in various incarnations. So we have Buddhist monk, a philosopher. He was a philosopher named as Kumarjev. And if you look at the works of Kumarjev, he is considered as one of the best translators. And if you look at the work of his Buddhist scriptures, he translated it from Sanskrit into Chinese. So whatever Buddhist literature are there in Sanskrit could have been because of the Sanskrit literature which are there. So Buddhist scriptures are translated from Sanskrit to Chinese by this particular scholar, translation scholar or a philosopher, Kumarjev. Also we have Sunit Kumar Pathak. He also provides an interesting account of the spread of Buddhist religion in Tibet, in Mongolia and Siberia. He writes that thousands of highly accurate renderings of Buddhist and Vedic texts were produced under royal patronage in Tibet. And that in the 9th century AD, if you see, there was a conference that was held. Look how scholarly advanced they were. They used to organize a conference, specifically translations, to standardize the techniques of translation in accordance with the Tibetan languages that were there, and also prosodies were translated at that time. So several secular texts like the plays of Kalidas that were translated during this period. Also we have famous Amarkosh which was there during this period. We find Amarkosh during this time only. So the stress was on highly fidelity. One of the things which we have to remember, the practice of translation during Buddhist era, how it is different from Sanskrit or ancient period. Because if you see during Buddhist era, there was too much of stress on the high fidelity to the source text. There was a focus on source text during Buddhist era, and that's why this kind of conferences were being organized. And if you see, they had to take the approval for the translation by the council of editors when this kind of conference were being organized. So if you look at this, how scholarly they were. So there were also scholars who reconstructed many Mahayana Buddhist texts which are missing in their original languages, and they translated in Tibetan. So Tibetan translations are available, and this Tibetan translations were translated into Sanskrit and Prakrit. So there were back translation process which also happened, and they were so accurate that you can translate it from Chinese to Sanskrit and Prakrit back. How advanced these translations could have been. So this translated text also later served the role of the source text for many other languages of Asia. These big translations became the source text. So the activity of translation, if you see during the Buddhist era, texts were so highly professional and they were so systematized activity that carried out with a purpose of producing highly accurate renderings. That is during Buddhist era. So translation then was a part of a larger project. That is, I said, proselytization. What does it mean? To introduce someone to convert to one's faith. So that is the practice during Sanskrit, ancient India and Buddhist era. Now let us look at the perspectives or theories that were there in the Vedic era and Buddhist era. But before that, if you remember, in the West, if you see, we have the Christian Platonic metaphysics, right? And this Platonic metaphysics attributed translation as a secondary activity, right? Why? Because it is an imitation, because it is a copy of an original and not the original. So we have post-Babylonian concept, we have post-Babylonian condition, and this Babel is seen as the other fall. So translation was considered as not a good activity, or there was no, it is not a primary activity, but it is a secondary status or a secondary activities that we have in the West during if you see Platonic metaphysics. And if you see, again it is so similar to Indian Vedic metaphysics. So if you see, this Platonic metaphysics are very similar to our Indian Vedic metaphysics. Why? If you see Vedic Indian metaphysics, they believe in essentialist, monistic, transcendental, unchanging the original, and we believed on absolute reality. Absolute nature should be of the reality. So we believed in absolutism, and because of that, we see each and everything that is changed, or all the changes which are there in the world, are illusionary. That is specifically superficial Maya is considered as. So whatever is changing is a Maya. So many scholars have used the concept of Maya, the concept of, or the metaphor of Maya. They've compared it with the metaphor of translation. So if you see, however, the application of this metaphor for the translation can again be used as two contrasting perspectives in the Indian metaphysical thought. We have the first dominant view, which is the Vedic view of translation. And according to, if you see the Vedic view, the inner, eternal, and transcendental essence known as the soul. We have the concept of Atma. It is transcendental, it is eternal, and it remains unchanged. And rebirth is merely a change of outward appearance. So in ancient India, we have texts like Srimad Bhagavad Gita, in which we find the concept of rebirth is merely a change of outward appearance. In Bhagavad Gita, Adhyay 2, Sloka 2, we have sloka like Vasansi Jirnani Yatha Vihai Navani Gruhanati Naroparani Tatha Sarirani Vihai Jirna Nyanyani Samyati Navani Dehi. What does this mean? It means that just as human beings, we constantly shade our old worn out clothes and and wear new attires. Like that, the Atma, it also referred to soul. So like Atma, it shades an old and worn out body and don a new body. So this notion of Atma is eternal and transcendental essence is also somewhat comparable to Derrida's terms as transcendental signified. We have the concept of signifier and signified. Derrida talks about transcendental signified. It keeps changing all the time. If you read the Western metaphysics, we have the concept of transcendental signified, which is talked by Derrida. That it keeps changing, the meaning keeps changing. And it remains the same in spite of the change in material signifiers. So it sees all the transformation, including translation, as an illusion and deception of senses. So while both Vedic ideology and Buddhist metaphysics, they embrace the concept of birth, they differ in their perspectives on reality. So one is a Vedic ideology, Vedic perspective of rebirth. Then we also have the Buddhist concept of rebirth. So if you look at Vedic thought, it sees reality as having essences and origins. While if you look at the Buddhist view, it believes reality is immanent. It constantly changes like river, and it lacks fixed essence or origins. So there are no origins. In Buddhist philosophy, if you see, anatma or non-self is considered as truth. The selfhood is not organic awareness. The concept of non-self is important. It is divisible and heterogeneous. It is not homogeneous. It is not same, but it is heterogeneous. So if you see, reality keeps changing. It is constantly being transformed. So the concept of Buddhist view, it believes transformation and change is the fundamental nature of existence, unlike Vedic view. One of the best examples we have is of the famous debate of the king Milind. So the Buddhist metaphysics, it holds that in spite of absence of eternal transcendental self, there is a cycle of rebirth, right? And birth and rebirth is there. So there is a cycle of birth, rebirth. And many, including the famous King Mendar, the King Milind I was talking about, he has a thought that this is actually contradictory. So we have Nagasena. In the book Milind Fano, there is a debate between the King Milind and Nagasena. And this debate clarifies this Buddhist notion of rebirth using another sparkling metaphor. So the dialogue goes something like that. First, the king asked that who is reborn, Nagasen, is they the same person or another? And Nagasen replies that neither it is the same nor the other. So he says that give me an illustration, give me an example. And he gives an example that in the case of we have something like pot of milk. Then if you churn it, it will turn into curd. Then it would be butter. Then ghee or chas, buttermilk. So it would not be rightly to say that the ghee or chas that you are talking about, or the butter or the curd, whether they are the same as the milk or they are different, because they have come from the same, right? They have come from the milk only. So neither would it be right to say that they are something else or they are same. So in short, if you see here, the transformation of one material ensemble into another is what takes place in the Buddhist thinking about rebirth. So thus, from the Buddhist perspective, if you see the translation, nothing is permanent and the world is constantly being transformed into something else. So we are constantly being translated along with the whole world. So Buddhists could accept the translated text far more positive spirit. In this class, we have talked about ancient translation during ancient era, during Buddhist era, and what were the different perspectives about translation during ancient and Buddhist era. And that is similar to the, we have metaphysics of rebirth. So scholars have argued about the metaphysics of rebirth, comparing it with the translation. In the next class, we shall look at the translation in the second millennium. Meanwhile, thank you for joining. See you in the next lecture.